Welcome to the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council with hosts Grace Evans and Moses Brattrud. Stay informed on the top stories on life, family, and religious freedom. Get the facts, stand for truth. Hello and welcome back to the Family Beacon podcast. My name is Grace Evans. I'm here with my awesome co-host, Moses Brattrud. Today, here's what we'll be discussing on the Family Beacon podcast. Moses will begin by giving us a legislative update about how the ERA has passed the Minnesota Senate and is now headed to the Minnesota House. We will also be discussing how the Democrats are refusing to expand the sales tax exemption here in Minnesota to baby products. Why would they refuse to do that? That's an excellent question. I will also share with you how Governor Noem of our bordering state in South Dakota has promised to fight the kidnapping bill. Finally, Moses will close out by explaining how MFC is fighting to keep women safe from the abortion pill. All right, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the episode. Moses, go ahead and give us that legislative update that we really want and tell us what is up with the ERA.
Yeah, so unfortunately, this bill passed the Minnesota Senate yesterday, and it's probably heading to the Minnesota House very soon. So the first thing I should say is that the ERA doesn't really, when you think about it, when you hear ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, people don't necessarily understand that this is actually quite a bad piece of legislation. So let's talk very quickly about what that is.
It sounds nice.
It sounds nice, right? And sometimes that's the worst things, because it makes it harder to tell between what's good and what's evil. So this bill, and this is SF37/HF173, you can look this up. It would put a ballot question on the 2024, not this fall, but on the 2024 ballot so that voters could decide whether to add this language to the Minnesota Constitution. Equality under the law shall not be abridged or denied by this state or any of its cities, counties, or other political subdivisions on account of race, color, creed, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, age, disability, ancestry, or national origin. So there's a lot of things there that, just to be clear, on the face of it, we would support. We don't support discrimination on the basis of race or on the basis of sex and employment or housing or things like that. And guess what? Those things are already illegal. They're illegal federally. They're illegal in Minnesota. They are illegal. So that leads us to ask the question, why would progressives spend so much energy on a bill that, or on a ballot question that could amend the Constitution in a way that is already, it seems superfluous? Well, that's kind of the point. So what the ERA actually is a Trojan horse. It looks nice. People, when you ask people on the street, they'll say, oh, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. But what it actually is meant to do is to create a blank check from Minnesota courts to create new forms of discrimination, especially based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and penalize Minnesotans who run afoul of these novel concepts. So the ERA will function, we believe, if it were passed, as sort of a super statute. And that'll be used by activist judges and groups like Gender Justice that we've discussed on the podcast before, already very active in Minnesota, attacking conscience rights, religious liberty, and the rights of the unborn. And it will be used to trample other constitutional rights, such as the free exercise of religion. And so, again, the ERA does not solve any specific problems that are actually existing. Remember, these things like discrimination in housing and employment is already illegal. So basically, you shouldn't support this unless you believe the courts in this state should be given the power to invent new forms of discrimination, and basically. It would threaten the safety of women and poses a threat to religious freedom. And that is especially ironic because the ERA from 50 years ago, the federal ERA, thou shalt not discriminate on the basis of sex. Obviously, that's not the actual language. That is this feminist cause célèbre, feminists have been fighting to get that added to the U.S. Constitution for years. But this new ERA, the ERA with sexual orientation and gender identity, et cetera, that is a whole different animal. So under the amendment, this could become law in Minnesota. This is why it's so important to tell your legislators and prepare to vote no on this amendment, and tell your friends. It could be considered discrimination to use pronouns based on biological sex, to quote unquote misgender someone. It could be discriminatory if churches have male-only clergy. It could be discriminatory if schools have single-sex classrooms. It could be discriminatory if schools don't allow transgender identified people on women's sports teams and women's locker rooms. And it could be even used as grounds to take away the tax exemption from, say, nonprofit Christian schools or churches that don't comply. So please take a moment, and this will be, if you're getting this through our email, scroll down and take a moment to fill in that action alert. Let your state representative know that the ERA does not represent you. Again, this passed the Minnesota Senate. Now we need to try and stop it from passing the Minnesota House. And we only have a very little time left to do this because the session will end on or before May 22nd.
Absolutely.
So very quick, we have no updates still on the health omnibus bill. So we're still waiting on tenterhooks to see if those horrible abortion provisions will make it into the final bill. Of course, as always, we're fighting publicly and behind the scenes to make sure that those things don't happen. Now, one of the things that sort of seems small, Grace, in terms of everything else that's happened this session, but when you think about it, it's kind of a big deal to me.
Yeah.
Is the sales tax exemption or lack of exemption? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, it's really shocking to me too, because we hear from Democrats, especially here in Minnesota, but all over the country, that they're pro-choice, they're pro-women, they're pro-children, they're just not pro-fetuses. And so when we hear them say that they're pro-choice, we think, okay, if they're pro-choice, that means probably that they should be pro-abortion, but they should also be pro-life. They should be pro whatever a woman, quote unquote, will choose.
Right.
That's what you think when you hear the term pro-choice. But the Democrats repeatedly here in Minnesota keep proving themselves wrong. They keep showing themselves that they're not pro-choice, they're just pro-abortion. So they did just that with this omnibus tax bill. They just recently, this week, Moses, refused to expand the sales tax exemption to baby products in that omnibus tax bill. And so because of that, Republicans are speaking out against the majority's decision, the DFL majority decision, to remove that bipartisan proposal. And so under this proposal, what would have happened is products like diapers, like pacifiers, formula, those are currently exempted from state and local sales taxes, which is awesome, like as they should be.
So those things are already exempted, and this would have been an expansion.
Exactly. That's what I'm about to explain. So that's already the case. And I think we can all agree that that's a great thing to be exempted from state and local sales taxes. I mean, that's a great help to families in need. So in both chambers, the Republicans therefore were trying to expand that exemption to not only those items, but to items like cribs, strollers, mattresses, car seats, wipes. And that's really good because those things are a lot more expensive. Those are bigger things like cribs, strollers, mattresses. Those add up. And then also wipes. I mean, that's a seemingly small expense, but I mean, you have kids, I have little siblings. Yeah. Those add up because you buy, however many packs of wipes every single year when you have babies.
I can tell you right now that diapers cost me about $40 a month.
Wow.
And of course, if I had more kids, it would be more. And wipes cost me about $25 per month.
That's crazy.
You'd think wipes would be a lot less expensive than diapers, but it's not a huge difference in terms of because you're using them so much. And I also would say, again, as a parent, car seats and strollers are extremely expensive. And it is also extremely important to have a car seat that's safe, to not have just an old crappy car seat, because I think, and this is something I had no idea before I was a parent, but they actually expire after something like 5 years, depending on the seat. So like you're it's not illegal to use them, but they're not as safe to use after that expiration date. Yeah. So, and that's potentially $100, $200, $300 that parents have to shell out per kid, because each kid needs their own car seat. And we're talking about, I'm stealing a little bit from you, but from what you were going to say, but Senator Coleman said this is only costing the state $7 million to do this when we have $18 billion sitting in the government's vaults because of the tax surplus. So I just think, couldn't we show a little bit of grace to parents? Guess not.
Exactly. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that quote. I think that's a really important quote from Senator Coleman. So again, the Democrats voted against expanding this exemption to cribs, strollers, mattresses, car seats, and wipes. So the question is, who is this benefiting? Obviously, it's not benefiting Minnesotan parents or Minnesota children. I don't know why they voted this way. Representative Elliot Engen, who is of White Bear Township, stated, "Happy Mother's Day, folks. That's what the DFL gave you," because they voted on this on Mother's Day. Delightful, of course.
Oof.
And yep, appreciate Coleman's quote. Also, I just wanted to point out that, so in response, Representative Gomez, who's a Democrat, and she's a chair of the House Taxes Committee, she kind of tried to like impress upon us how it's fine that the Democrats didn't go ahead and stick with that great addition to the omnibus bill. She's just kind of proudly talking about it. She said, quote, to Axios, she said, quote, "Our tax bill is laser focused on making Minnesota the best place to raise children. We make targeted investments that reduce child poverty for low income families, and there are other provisions that could have a greater effect than the baby product exemption." Now my question is, what other investments, what other provisions? Like, is she not going to expound upon those other provisions? Because to me, it just seems like Minnesota is trying to become this baby killing machine and is just standing against parents and standing against mothers and fathers. So I just think that totally skirts around the actual, I mean, they're just saying, oh, we don't actually need to do those things. We do all these other things. But the question is, what other things is Minnesota doing to make it so that it's easier to raise children rather than easier to kill them?
Yeah, it sort of seems like just like with the positive alternatives grant, which, again, as you were saying, like there's this distinction, or there should be, between being pro-choice and being pro-abortion. But if you're taking away the positive alternatives, if you're not wanting women to have access to pregnancy resource centers who could help them connect with adoption resources, connect them with anything they need, free maternal care, some of them, free diapers, because diapers are expensive. If you're not in favor of that, then we need to talk about you being pro-abortion, not just pro-choice. And it's kind of the same thing here. If you're for making baby products more expensive, then I'm going to question whether you like babies, whether you want more of them. And in fact, our state needs more of them. And I'm not going to go on the rant again about having more babies. But, as a state, that's just something that needs to happen. And I'll make a point for Representative Gomez. She says she doesn't mention what they've done to reduce poverty for low-income families. And there is this child tax credit that was just announced, I think, yesterday, or just agreed upon. And that could, and fair is fair, that could actually help low-income families by giving them more money in their pocket. And it is really targeted at very low-income families. I'm in principle, I haven't looked at the details, but in principle, I'm fine with that. But let's do it on both ends. So those families are paying less in tax. So let's also allow them to pay less in tax on baby products. It just makes sense to me. Like,
I just don't understand what the incentive would be to vote against something like that. It doesn't make sense at all, especially with that surplus that was noted by Senator Coleman. Okay, so one other thing I also wanted to just bring you guys up to speed on is kind of what's up with the kidnapping bill. As you know, Governor Walz did sign that into law, and that's what he calls, quote, the trans refuge bill, which, again, this bill enables minors to cross state lines and to undergo gender transition surgery, even if their parents disagree, and they can also be taken out of their parents' custody by a court of the Minnesota state if their parents disagree with dangerous gender ideology. So this is a lethal bill, truly, truly dangerous. And so in light of this, 24 Minnesota legislators have called on Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota, one of our border states. They have asked her to, quote, impose penalties against anyone participating materially in luring or transporting South Dakota minors to Minnesota for gender-affirming healthcare. They continue, "It is our belief that a line now needs to be drawn here at this exact point in our history as a nation. Criminal penalties for kidnapping and child mutilation are in order and well justified." And I think that is just a great statement right there. This is the moment in time that we are going to look back on in 50 years, maybe 100 years, maybe even less than that. And we're going to think, why did people do nothing? And
Absolutely.
Let it not be said that we did nothing. We are standing up, and so are 24 brave Minnesota legislators. So this is necessary because of the fact that Tim Walz has violated the full faith and credit clause of the U.S. Constitution, which requires, quote, that state courts respect the laws and judgments of courts from other states. So in South Dakota, there are recent laws that have been brought up in South Dakota. Noem signed a bill in February that prohibits South Dakota doctors from providing puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, gender reassignment surgeries to minors, etc. And so this kidnapping bill here in Minnesota was kind of a response to that state as well as other states. And so due to that clause from the U.S. Constitution, these legislators are saying, okay, what's happening in Minnesota is out of step with what South Dakotans want. And so therefore, Governor Kristi Noem, please make sure you're imposing these criminal penalties. And so according to these legislators, these brave 24 legislators, Minnesota Democrats are, quote, profoundly breaking faith with the state of South Dakota in a matter that could not be more sacred or central to the well-being and interests of the people of South Dakota. They continue, we are hereby making the most urgent appeal that you issue a public statement to the effect that penalties will be imposed against anyone, etc., participating in those things we just discussed, including so-called gender reassignment surgery and other related medical procedures. They continue, states must be held accountable for going so far as to violate the U.S. Constitution to commit acts that are inherently evil. Actions which result in the mutilation of children are crimes, and the perpetrators, along with their accomplices, must be held accountable.
Absolutely.
I think that's a very strong statement. I think it's very bold. I think it's very bold of those 24 legislators because I'm sure they're undergoing a lot of heat right now. Their families are probably undergoing a lot right now because that is a very bold statement to state in our current culture war, and especially in Minnesota, where there are some people that very much disagree, that are totally in favor of child mutilation and think that it's a matter of social justice and that, you know, every child deserves the right to have his or her body mutilated. And so I'm very thankful, and I think that it's a wise move on their position, on their part, and we will see what Governor Noem does in response to this.
Yeah. I really think that we need to do a couple things. First of all, they should send that letter to the governor of Iowa, and the governor of North Dakota, and either the governor or legislators in Wisconsin, because I think the governor there would not be friendly to that letter. But if Minnesota is going to have a couple of years, and it's probably going to be a couple years before we can reverse these things, right, and make Minnesota a state that's truly safe for kids, then at least what we can do is encourage states that border us to not contribute to the insanity that's happening here, because Minnesota, progressives in Minnesota want to make this a state where kids come to get gender mutilation surgery and women come to get abortion. Like, that is literally what they want. And they think that they're doing some amazing thing by doing that, because they think it's such a shame if a kid in Iowa is denied gender mutilation surgery, or if a woman in North Dakota is not able to get an abortion. But actually, those are good things, because abortion is bad and gender mutilation surgery is bad. So they have it backwards, right? But if during this time, when there's a couple years where Minnesota needs to get its stuff together, pardon my French, then let's ask those other states to be advocates for their own kids, to protect their own kids and women in those states, while people in this state want to threaten them. I think I'm just so proud of those legislators, and I hope that as you said, I hope that turns into action.
Yeah, thank you, Moses. All right, before we share our verse, Moses, at the end of this podcast episode, let's just go ahead and update our viewers on how Minnesota Family Council is fighting to keep women safe from the abortion pill, which we've discussed multiple times here on the podcast. Let's talk about our work in fighting this atrocity.
Absolutely. So we joined 27 other pro-life groups and individuals in filing a really important brief with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, urging it to block the FDA, that's the Food and Drug Administration's approval of the abortion pill, mifepristone. So you probably have been, we've talked about this issue, how the question of the abortion pill's legality has been challenged in court recently. And And so that brief is filed just a few days ago, and in just a few days, the Fifth Circuit Court, federal court in New Orleans, will hear oral arguments in a crucial case on the abortion pill legality, and this is brought by Alliance Defending Freedom. So a little bit of background on that. The organizations and FDA argue that the FDA violated the law when it approved mifepristone for abortions. And so the letter that we signed on to says this: because abortion is not a treatment and pregnancy is not an illness and is not itself serious or life-threatening, and because mifepristone is more dangerous and less effective than the alternative, surgical abortion, the FDA abused its regulation in approving mifepristone in the year 2000. Yep. So, the importance of this case is hard to understate. 50% of all abortions are done via the abortion pill. And we also know, and Grace has discussed this at length in previous episodes, how dangerous the abortion pill is, of course, to children, but also to women. The side effects including hemorrhage, infection, dizziness, and even in some cases, death. So the abortion pill is not safe. And I think we need to get around that, get to that fact. And we also need to say it's pretty clear that the FDA violated their own rules. I mean, that's violated even federal law. That's how this case was allowed to get this far, right? It's not just a vendetta against the abortion pill, that this case has legal merit, and that's why it's proceeding through the federal court system. So I want you guys to think about that and pray about that case, because that could be a huge victory.
Absolutely.
And it would be a boon in Minnesota, but it would also be a great thing in other states, especially states where abortion clinics have closed. Because what is happening, and we know this, is that organizations in blue states, organizations in Mexico and in Europe are mailing abortion pills to women in in red states who are unable to drive to Chicago or to Seattle or whatever to get an abortion, and
package them to secretively. That's the thing,
right? Yep. They do everything they can to make it very unclear that is what that is. Okay, Grace. So I want to close out this episode with, I hope, a word of encouragement. And this is going to be from 1 Corinthians 15.
I think I read that for our first podcast episode. That was the verse I chose.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Wait, you mean just a few weeks ago? Oh.
Yeah, I love that verse. But read it again.
That's
it's
why
so
it's
good.
familiar. Okay.
Did you pull it because of that?
Well, I pulled it because it's in my it's in a fundraising letter. I did not come up with it. It's a fundraising letter that MFC is sending out.
Excellent. Well, we got. You can never hear this verse too much. So let's go ahead. and read
that's
it.
So great that we picked the same verse.
Because I was going to read that for the podcast maybe, but then I was like, oh no, we already used that one for the podcast.
Oh, that's
so funny. But do it. It's so good.
Well, yeah, it's a perfect verse for such a time as this. Is. So this is the word of God. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So it's so hard to be steadfast and immovable when we see this maelstrom of insanity around us. And it's also so hard to know that our labor is not in vain when we don't see the fruits of those labors. But we can toil our whole lives sometimes without seeing the fruits of those labors, and yet we can trust and come to know that Jesus makes that work have meaning. In the Lord our labor is not in vain. Amen. So that is, I think, an incredibly powerful word for us to end on as we go out into the week or into the weekend, depending on when you're watching. Please pray for our legislature in the last week of its session, unless of course there's a special session, God forbid.
Right.
And there's things that are left unresolved, and we'll talk about that next week. So thank you so much for tuning in to the Family Beacon podcast with Grace Evans and me, Moses Brattrud, and please check us out again next time.
Thanks for listening to or watching this episode of the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you're up to date on life, family, and religious freedom. You can follow us on Instagram at MN Family Council and subscribe to us on YouTube to watch our content. Get the facts, stand for truth.